We are already translating our application a little bit when we created the resources for Spanish for the names of our categories. So we have those names already in English and we have them in Spanish. We are from the view models for both the categories and the new expense VMs, setting the category's name to those resources using the app resources. Now, if we want to set these names directly from SAML, there is an additional step that we have to make. We have to expose these resources, these app resources, to SAML in a certain way that, well, we can actually use it with SAML syntax without us having to name all of the elements, because of course what we could do is simply, for example, this button, access from the code behind its text and set it in the same way that we have just done with the categories and the new expense VMs. So what I will do, and is something that I want to show you how to, is create our own SAML extension. Just as there are extensions for static resources and bindings, and the new extension that we used in another one of our examples for on-platform specific values, we can create our own extension. And because this is related to the view, I will do it in the views folder. I will create a new file, and this one is going to be an empty class. And let me just call this translate extension. Now it's important to notice that the extension suffix is going to be excluded when we use it from SAML. So even though my class is going to be called translate extension, when we use it from SAML, all we have to write is translate. So SAML is already going to know that this is an extension because we're going to be implementing the I markup extension interface, which will have a provide value method. And by the way, we want to set it for the text property. So the text property will be the one that can use this extension. So of course, in the bottom, the text is the one that can use the translate extension. For that, all I have to write is right before the class, the content property attributes, and set it to be text, just like this. And now the interesting thing, of course, is going to happen inside of the provide value method. Now for the provide value method, we're also going to require a few more things. First of all, we're going to have to know what the current culture is. And for this, let me actually create a variable that is going to be accessible from all of the methods, because I'm going to be setting it in the constructor and accessing it from the provide value method. So this will be a read-only variable that is going to be of type culture info. Culture info is inside of system.globalization. That is at the beginning simply going to be null, but I want to initialize it in the constructor right away. All we have to do really is access the current culture. So by simply accessing from culture info the current culture, we now have the culture info. Another thing that we will need is the actual text that is going to be set. So the text that we are going to be passing. Just as, for example, the static resource receives a VM, we are going to be receiving something. That something is the thing that I will need. And so I will create a property that is going to be called, this is going to be a string, and it's going to be called text. This text will have to, we as developers will have to know that has to be set to the name of the data that we have to display. So again, just like the static resource received this VM, we are going to be receiving, for example, housing category. And so in here in the translate extension, I will have to use this text to know which resource I want to access from the app resources. Immediately, I can evaluate the text in the provide value method. So if text is null or empty, and let me actually make the evaluation like this. Let's evaluate if this is null or white space, the text. If this is true, we just want to return an empty string. But if not, that means that we received a text. So we should search for that text in the data that is coming from the app resources. And if we find one resource, meaning that there is a data with that specific name, we return it. If not, then maybe we again return an empty string. So how do we get that value? For this, then, let me define another static read-only variable that is going to be resource manager. To be able to use resource manager, we access it from system.resources. And let me just call this resource manager. And this is immediately going to be equal to a new resource manager. Now, we of course could initialize this as any resource manager, but what I do want you to define this as a lazy resource manager. So let me change this definition to be lazy of type resource manager. What this will do is make sure that the resources are used in a better way. So defining a type like this, like lazy, it may be a good name because what it's going to do is that this is only going to be created when it is required. If it's not required, this is not really going to be instantiated. So when using the resource manager, we're actually going to be quite careful with managing the resources correctly. So this is simply a good practice to initialize this resource manager in a lazy way. So just define the resource manager in lazy, but this is still a resource manager. And we can still initialize this as a new resource manager, except of course this time this is going to be in lazy format. As we initialize it, let me actually handle this directly in a Lambda expression inside of here. And because this is lazy, I actually have to initialize the resource inside of the lazy constructor. So I will create a new resource manager in here and notice that it has 3 overloads. The one that I want is the second overload. And I will simply in here pass as a string the resource ID. Now my resource ID is actually going to be what I have over in the app resources. In the designer, notice that in fact a resource manager is being created in here. I am going to do something quite similar to this. I have to create it with this ID, which is simply the namespace and the namespace plus the name of the resources, which is app resources. So I will simply pass this string. And for the second parameter, which is the assembly, I will use the introspection extensions type, for which I need a using directive to system.reflection, which has a get type info method. And all I have to do is pass the type of the current extension where we are. So I pass translate extension. And this is going to provide access to its assembly, which is the second parameter that we needed to pass. And so we have already the resource manager. That means that through the resource manager, we can get the actual value for a particular data element, which we have already in the text. The text, remember, is going to contain the name of a particular data element. So let's go ahead and get the translation using the resource manager. And we have the value type, and we will be able to get it through the get string method. Now the get string method, notice, is precisely going to require the name. And that name, we know it's already inside of text. And it is also going to require the culture info. And the culture info is already inside of our CI variable, which means that we can simply return this translation. And that's it. Now, there are some scenarios, I am sure, where we as developers make the mistake of passing a text that doesn't really have any translation, or maybe the translation is not ready. So we should definitely evaluate if the translation is null. If it is, it means that the translation either is not ready, or we made a typo, or something like that. So in here, of course, we could simply return an empty string, as I said, or maybe you want to throw an exception, or you can just set up the functionality that you want in here. What I will do is return an empty string, just like I do when the text is null or empty. So I make sure that even in those scenarios when there is no translation, my application doesn't crash. So my extension, my markup extension, is ready. Now we can start to use it directly from our XAML files. Now for that, let me go ahead and grab the namespace for my markup extension. And I'm going to need to define an XML namespace over here. So let me go ahead and define TE for translate extension, which is going to be that expenses app.views. Now, before I go ahead and use this extension to set, for example, the text in the label and the text in the button, let me actually create the actual texts that are going to be displayed. For example, in this case, categories should be also translated to Spanish, and also button. So over here I am creating a new data for the title. I am going to be calling this title, and I'm going to be creating a new for button label. Normally you want to be a little bit more specific, so you know exactly of which button is this going to be the label of. Currently I only have this one button, so I can just leave it like this. And I will of course need the same thing in Spanish. So I have for the title and the button label the translations. And so now I can use this name to pass the value to that extension. So what I will do is, let's just start with a label, change the text, which is now going to be using an extension. And the extension, actually let me build my project first, which means that I have to, have a semicolon in the wrong place in here. Let's try one more time. And now let me go ahead and replace these categories for the translate extension that we're going to find inside of TE. And we will be able to set the name, which is the name of the property that we have over here in our extension. This string that we have right here, which again, as I've been telling you, is going to be the name of the resource. In this case, for this label, this is going to be equal to title. And something very similar is going to happen for the button. I am, of course, going to be using that extension instead of the hard-coded text, but instead of the title, I'm going to use the button label. So we're simply using an extension and setting directly from SAML the value of one of its properties, the text property, which is eventually being used to get the actual translation. And actually, of course, this is not supposed to be a name, this is text. The name of my property is text. Now let me go ahead and test this out. So as soon as it runs here on Android, we see the exact same result, because this is in English. But this is already coming from SAML. And we are not hard coding these values. These are already coming from an app resources file. Which means that if I stop my application and change the culture, and I'm going to be doing it directly from the language preferences. So the culture or the language is now set to Spanish, and I open the expenses app again. These two labels, or the label and the text from the button, are now going to be coming from the resources, which means that I will have the translated versions available. So this is how you translate using the same resources, but now directly from SAML. All we needed to create was this extension, and of course have this property that is the one that we will have to set when we use those extensions. And simply use the resource manager to get the actual string for a particular value, getting the name from these data elements for a particular culture info. Of course, the translation is not ready. We only have a few data elements for a few of the strings inside of our application. In an application that you're actually going to show to the world, you will need to make sure that you translate as much as you can, aiming, of course, for 100% translation, which is currently not the case for our application, but hopefully you now know exactly what to do to finish up the translation of any application that you have. Now that you have learned how to do this translation on both Android and iOS, in the next section we're going to learn, just like in the previous section we learned a few things about Android specific things, we're going to learn how to do them on iOS as well.